Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. I can only disappoint, so let's get that over with. And I want to add my thanks for the generosity of this invitation and for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. It's great to see many colleagues and friends. I hope they won't take it amiss if I say it's even better to see some people I don't think I know. So thank you if you don't feel you have to be here. That's especially gracious of you on a very, very dark night. And it's an enormous honour for me to give that 15th Notre Dame Shakespeare lecture in the presence of Professor Sir Stanley Wells, as well as with a formidable roster of previous lecturers. What I'm going to talk about this evening is the way our attitudes to Shakespeare and the plays we have felt best express what we value about him have changed over time. And that makes it a particular privilege to acknowledge the inspiration and impact of our honorand. I could have picked any number of titles. That's a pretty extraordinary not even a life's work, but that's a pretty extraordinary selection of Stanley's impact on our field. But I wanted to begin, in fact, with this book from 2002, Shakespeare for All Time. This is a bravura account that really only Stanley could write of Shakespeare's life, his works, and his afterlife, from Stratford to Southwark to South Africa, and with a particular emphasis on what he calls the degree to which the works of Shakespeare permeate the world's culture. He is in the water supply, concludes Wells, no pun intended, and is likely to remain there until the pipes run dry. No danger of that today. So I want to acknowledge this temporal and geographical ubiquity, but to focus this evening on a more specific bit of cultural plumbing. What's the Shakespeare play for our moment? What should we be reading and discussing, performing and rewriting, editing and teaching in the UK and in the US in 2026? And because it's both about Shakespeare and about our moment, this talk can't ever be innocent of the particular tenor and mood of our times. Shakespeare never was and isn't now apolitical. We can talk about that as we go along and in the question period, but I make no apologies for the presentness and sometimes the presentistness of what I want to suggest this evening. There are some blank slides, so don't worry, it's all gone wrong. So perhaps my opening question, what's the Shakespeare play for now, needs itself a bit of context. Asking what's the Shakespeare play for our moment may seem a false start, because isn't it because Shakespeare is so timeless that we place such high value on his works, not for an age, but for all time, as fellow playwright and frenemy Ben Jonson wrote in his elegy 400 years ago. And the Shakespeare industry, in theatre, in schools and colleges, and in publishing, has seemed heartily to agree. Whatever the circumstances we face, the restoration of the British monarchy, wars with France, the quest for civil rights, colonial violence, the pandemic, somehow Shakespeare is always already there. Precisely perhaps because his works aren't about any of these issues, they seem to have a particular affordance to be made to address them. Clearly, this is some combination of internal factors. What is it about Shakespeare's works that enable this adaptability? But also, importantly, actually, about external factors. How did we get so convinced they could speak quite so widely that are at play here? But there's a flip side to this ubiquity. Most plays have not always been popular. Maybe Shakespeare himself has not always been popular. It isn't widely agreed, but my own sense is that by the time he died in 1616, Shakespeare was already a bit of a has-been, and it took quite a while for those plays to be rehabilitated. The First Folio, I think, is significant in that. But we can see too in quite recent times that Shakespeare's plays are not always equally relevant or equally acceptable to different periods. Let's take, for instance, Shakespeare's play about the Trojan War, Troilus and Cressida. This play is an extraordinary, cynical take on an unwinnable war. There are no heroes. No one can quite really remember why the war began or imagine how it could end. It's hard for the audience really to think who might win, who should win. And it ends not with the tragic death of divided lovers, but the corrosive compromise that comes from crossing the line between friend and foe. I like this comedy sketch by Mitchell and Webb, which has become a great meme. You'll see one Nazi soldier says to the other, "Are we the baddies?" Troilus and Cressida has had a glitchy place in the Shakespearean canon, right up to the mid-century in the US, when it became, of course, as many people here know, the perfect play to think about Vietnam. The 20th century playwright George Bernard Shaw said of the other plays from the middle of Shakespeare's career, like Troilus and Cressida, dubbed problem plays by Victorian critics, that they proved, quote, Shakespeare was ready and willing to start at the 20th century if the 17th would let him. The rise of Measure for Measure, for example, with its expose of fictions of consent, power, and bodily autonomy in the age of Weinstein and Me Too, is evidence of that fact. That's to say, these are arguments not about timelessness, that Shakespeare captures eternal truths, but almost, in fact, its opposite, timeliness. Plays come into prominence at different moments. The Trump first presidency began with Julius Caesar's, most prominently in Central Park in 2017, when numerous corporate sponsors withdrew from a production that was widely and uncritically assumed to advocate assassinating the president. The Shakespearean and perhaps the wider political mood quickly shifted to Macbeth's depictions of tyranny and fear. But as we know from Shakespeare, these always also carry a notable sympathy for their central protagonist. The best attempt to conceptualize this shift is, I think, a book by the UK scholar R.A. Folks called Hamlet versus Lear. I've always liked this book, not least its title, for its superhero vibe. Folks traces a shift in the respective critical and theatrical fortunes of these two contenders for top tragedy. During the period from the beginning of Shakespeare's critical revival at the start of the 19th century up to about 1950, Hamlet, Folks points out, was undisputed best play. The prominence of Hamlet clearly had something to do with the fact that a cohort of introspective, overeducated men worried about whether there was a God and whether they wanted to sleep with their mothers all saw themselves in a play about an overeducated, introspective man wondering about whether there was a God, etc. I promised in the blurb for this lecture I will be rude about Hamlet. I think that's probably the piece of writing that has had most traction that I've ever done in my whole life, that sentence, I will be rude about Hamlet. So perhaps I'll just quote the director Katie Mitchell speaking on Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago. Personally, said Katie Mitchell about Hamlet, I'm tired of plays about depressed, angry, misogynistic men. And maybe I will add to it, I'm tired too of the assumption that this in some way represents the human condition. But around the 1950s and 60s, Folks notes, King Lear comes into prominence. Folks puts this shift alongside a list of world events, the Cold War, nuclear arms race, apartheid in South Africa, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The point of the juxtaposition is to track the relationship between the play and a world to which it is able newly to speak. The rise of King Lear was into a world which could no longer spend its time in Hamlety self-centeredness. It needed a play that could speak the bleak pain of human cruelty and suffering. Lear triumphed in the later 20th century because its cruelties were aligned to the age. There's one more piece to this Folks argument. In order to take up its place as top tragedy for the post-war, post-Auschwitz world, King Lear itself had to change. That's to say, earlier critics of King Lear had tended to emphasize that play's tentative hopes of redemption. You'll be familiar with this idea, why tragedy is cathartic. Okay, the hero loses everything and dies, but they have gained self-knowledge. hubba hubba, as Aristotle, I think, didn't say. A.C. Bradley, the most influential critic of Shakespeare's tragedies in the 20th century, who wrote right at the beginning of the 20th century, but continued to be read and taught throughout our period, described the ending of the play influentially as Lear's redemption. This is Bradley. There is nothing more noble and beautiful in literature than Shakespeare's exposition of the effect of suffering in reviving the greatness and eliciting the sweetness of Lear's nature. But sceptical voices were already in the wings. The same period that elevated Troilus and Cressida, and as we've already seen, was ready to assess Lear as a tragedy of injustice, nihilism, and despair, not of redemption. This existentialist Lear was closer, as many theatre makers identified, to Samuel Beckett than it was to the biblical book of Job. So Folks' assessment of the factors that produced Lear's tragic dominance in the later 20th century is also a list of the reasons why Lear itself came to look like a different play. So that's a version of Shakespeare's timeliness in both the times and the plays themselves are shifting, sometimes converging, as in Lear, into patterns that emphasize congruence and cultural echo. So far I've tried to modify the assumption of Shakespeare's timelessness into something more like timeliness through a brief track of the intermittent capacity of particular plays to speak to particular moments. I hope that begins to suggest that Shakespeare's relevance is not entirely immanent within the plays themselves. It's achieved, if it's achieved at all, in dialogue with the present. And we've heard about Folks' deposition of Hamlet and his coronation of Lear, but we are still, I think, away from Shakespeare now. Folks' book was published in 1993, and I'm delighted that there are people here who were not born then. Talking about Shakespeare at the end of the 20th century is in no way the same as talking about Shakespeare now. What has changed in the 3 decades since Folks' assessment? And if a new Shakespeare contender were to come in and wrestle Hamlet to the ground, who would it be? For a while, and particularly after the attacks of 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror, it seemed as if the 21st century would be the era of Othello. This tragedy circling around themes of exclusion and othering by race, by gender, and by socioeconomic status, with its setting in a broadly middle-class domestic world rather than a royal one, might seem to have a number of claims on our attention. And its larger-scale politics were also strikingly resonant. The play's militarized setting, the Venetian base on Cyprus, anticipates that Eastern Mediterranean islands' ongoing role in the West's aggressive relationship to the Arab world. Now, in the 21st century, still divided between Greek and Turkish communities and occupied by military forces euphemistically called peacekeeping troops, Cyprus serves as a launchpad, literally, for missions against, for example, Houthi rebels in Yemen or the Iranian nuclear industry, working closely with the government of Israel and serving as the local control center for US policy in the Middle East. Writing in October 2001, just weeks after the attack on the World Trade Center that redefined the geopolitics of the 21st century, our colleague Jonathan Bates described Othello's place on the east-west frontier between Christianity and Islam, while he said 21st century forces of global capitalism waged against the imperative of Islamic fundamentalism. Few literary questions, predicted Bates, will be of more significance than that of how best to interpret and perform this play, Othello. I'm not here, though, actually to suggest that Othello should be the contender to top tragedy, not least because of the impact on my thinking of powerful voices in the field of pre-modern critical race studies, and especially perhaps the Othello whisperer, Ayanna Thompson. I've long admired Thompson's clear challenge to easy assumptions of Othello's relevance or adaptability, which do not at the same time acknowledge the play's ongoing harm. She notes that while people that while people constantly strive to recuperate the play as a critique of its own poisonous attitudes, it is ultimately resistant to such attempts. It is, she reminds us, ultimately a toxic play. I would just say, Thompson told the Shakespeare's Globe podcast, keen to know how to make it all better, just don't do Othello. It's a good reminder that plays can resonate with our own moment, not because they unexpectedly endorse Enlightenment values of tolerance and empathy, but because they continue to restate convenient and harmful toxic hierarchies and attitudes that mar human flourishing. So not Othello then. I'm going to look elsewhere. One assumption about Folks's arm wrestle between Hamlet and Lear is that, of course, the greatest play, the play that would speak most to the hopes and preoccupations of an era, would be a tragedy. Perhaps that's obvious. Of course, tragedy with its moral seriousness and its competing philosophies and its existential questioning is more significant than girls dressed as boys, incomprehensible banter, and the unusual propensity for twins to be separated during sea voyages. We have had, since Aristotle's Poetics was rediscovered in the West, a largely unexamined idea that it is tragedy that presents the urtext of humanity. Aristotle's famous description of tragedy as, you all know this, an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, through pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation or catharsis of these emotions, which emphasizes its weightiness, serious, complete, magnitude, pity, fear, purgation. Tragedy's preoccupation with men of high status establishes it in the political realm. Its traffic with human suffering places it in the emotional one. I won't attempt a survey of the history of tragic criticism, but the roll call of names alone speaks to the solemnity with which Western culture has taken and continues to take tragedy, from Hegel to Nietzsche to Bloom and Nussbaum. The ethical ramifications of ancient and of Shakespearean tragedy have repeatedly been investigated as part of the moral apparatus of humanity itself. In his postmodern medieval whodunit, The Name of the Rose, it's a kind of mashup of Brother Cadfael and Georges-Louis Borges, Umberto Eco's detective friar William of Baskerville has to unravel a spate of murders in a northern Italian monastery. Look away now if you don't want to know the solution. These shenanigans are prompted by questions about the circulation of a unique manuscript, the second part of Aristotle's treatise, his views on comedy. As William discovers, there are powerful ecclesiastical authorities in Eco's novel who want to suppress this book on comedy. Comedy, after all, at least in that book, is much more dangerous and challenging than tragedy. Tragedy ultimately affirms the dignity of the human, and in the end, the verdict of tragedy is that the central figure did matter. His struggles were significant. They were, in Aristotle's terms, serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. It is, I think, a form that is ultimately conservative. That's to say, tragedy as a form corroborates its central figure's conviction of his own importance. In Shakespeare's plays, it usually is his. And the tragic play shapes itself as a biopic in which there is nothing of consequence after the death of the central figure. The rest is silence, as Hamlet tells us. Tragedy makes those figures who are left behind after the carnage the genre equivalent of what video gamers might call NPCs, non-playing characters. They are irrelevant. To be alive at the end of a tragedy is to be an utter non-entity in the world of the play, not important enough for the spotlight of death. To keep on keeping on is somewhat to be despised. Comedy, on the other hand, is made up of the pointless and mundane world of those non-playing characters, the NPCs. Its casting is ensemble, splitting the play's lines among a group of people who push the action forward through dialogue, not soliloquy. Comedy promises, even if it doesn't always fully embrace, the possibility of subversion, of puncturing, of emphasizing the folly and hollowness of tragic delusions. Early theories of comedy, including in the Shakespearean period, emphasized that it was concerned with regular people, not high-ranking people like tragedy. As George Putnam put it, comedies deal with, quote, common behaviors of private persons and such as were the meaner sort of men, us here. Whereas tragic writers meddled not with so base matters, they set forth the doleful falls of unfortunate and afflicted princes. Comedy is about us, that's to say, not our afflicted overlords. Tragedy hardly knows that we exist. I think comedy at least remembers to ask us how the kids are doing and has a stab at our name on the takeaway coffee cup. The monks of Echo's fictional abbey are being murdered because the church cannot allow an Aristotelian imprimatur, the cultural stamp of approval, on comedy's anti-authoritarian impulses. Power can cope with anything except being laughed at. You didn't laugh first time, but maybe we'll do it again. Umberto Eco's inventive fable is true in one particular, of course. Aristotle's views on comedy have not survived. We can only imagine what Western literature and philosophy might have looked like had one of its foundational aesthetic and ethical documents been a theory of comedy rather than tragedy. Now, Shakespeare's comedies, of course, have an obscure relation to laughter, as you will know from lifelong experience, I'm sure. In part, that's because what makes us laugh is quite culturally and historically specific. In part, it's because comedy in Shakespearean terms is not absolutely synonymous with laughter. Like Dante's great medieval poem, The Divine Comedy, Shakespeare's comedies inhabit a shape as much as they embody a mood. And that mood is communal, communitarian, and ultimately, I want to suggest, resilient. At their best, Shakespeare's comedies are not sugar sweet, and nor do they ignore the problems and compromises that are part of human life, but they incorporate them into the ongoing and relational work of futurity. Let me explain for a few minutes what I mean by that. When things go wrong in tragedy, it's a one-way street. Once Lear has divided the kingdom between his daughters, it doesn't matter how much he regrets it, how much he realizes Cordelia was the nice one after all, or how much he learns about human nature in the storm, or how refreshed is his perspective on the poor naked wretches outside the comfort of royal life. It doesn't matter at all. It's over. It's done. Often tragedy and inevitability, therefore, are paired. I think my favorite version of this is in the French writer Jean Ennuy's translation of the great Greek tragedy Antigone. Ennui inserts a chorus speech which says, "The spring is wound up tight, it will uncoil of itself. That is what is so convenient in tragedy. The least little turn of the wrist will do the job. The rest is automatic. You don't need to lift a finger. The machine is in perfect order. It has been oiled ever since time began. And it runs without friction. Tragedy is clean, restful, flawless. It is restful, and the reason is that hope, that foul, deceitful thing, has no part in it." So inevitability for Ennui is the absence of hope. It's a version of that cliche that it's the hope that does for you in the end. There isn't much sense in most versions of tragedy of mercy, of forgiveness, or of an alternative. Comedy, by contrast, operates according to what the scholar Susan Snyder so brilliantly called evitability, the opposite of inevitability, the possibility that things can be different, that human agency and ingenuity and patience can make things different. Right now, in 2026, perhaps hope, that foul, deceitful thing, as Ennui put it, is just about still alive and kicking, but a bit bruised and bewildered by events. Nevertheless, I think it's this that Shakespeare Now might need to give us. Writing in 2019 after the aftermath of American storms, hurricanes, flooding, and other evidence of climate change, Joseph Campana noticed anew how preoccupied Shakespeare's comedies are with the sea and its dangers. This is the phrase of Campana that I like best. The hope embedded in the comedies and so-called romances, by that he means, as you know, the plays written late in Shakespeare's career, like The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. So the hope embedded in the comedies and the so-called romances is that what is lost or wrecked can be recovered or remade. What is lost or wrecked can be recovered or remade. That prefix re is really, in some ways, the kind of syntax of comedy. Which do we prefer to spectate, Campana asks, disaster or recovery? Let's pick up that challenge and say that perhaps our cultural preference to spectate disaster, the aesthetic of tragedy, should be replaced, at least for a short time, by a preference for recovery, the narrative art of comedy. Comedy's work of remaking and rediscovery is easy to sneer at, but it feels like the best we've got. And if the world comedy remakes shows its scars, as in the Japanese form of visible mending, usually translated as golden joinery, let's lean into that. So the Shakespeare I want to suggest today for the last bit of this lecture is not about tragic heroes slugging it out for supremacy, but a claim for comedy as the genre with the most claims on our attention right now, and a specific comedy at that. The reveal will be less than a surprise for many people here, I think. But stand aside, Hamlet, back off, Lear, and welcome, Twelfth Night. I was asked some time ago to give my 5 favorite or recommended Shakespeare plays to a website called 5 Books. Stanley Wells had previously been given the same assignment. And I'm reassured this evening that the only play to appear on both of our lists was Twelfth Night. This gives me a bit more confidence to bring forward Twelfth Night as the play I want to propose for the 21st century. And just to say, that's not because Twelfth Night has sorted everything out. It hasn't. It ends as comedies do, with fudge, compromise, and disappointment. It's not because Twelfth Night is an escape from the real world. It's not that either, I don't think. Nor is it even because the play is funny. I think it sometimes is, but you may have to trust me on that. Rather, what I want to suggest about Twelfth Night is that it is its unsettledness and its acceptance of imperfection and compromise as a feature of individual humans and the societies they create that is its predominant claim on our modern attention. By saying I think we should attend seriously and playfully to Twelfth Night, I hope I'm not arguing for an idealistic view of the play. What I'm suggesting instead that its own particular frictions give us something to work with as we think through the wounded world we have inherited, if you're a young person, or created, if you're my age. So a little bit of backup about Twelfth Night, a late comedy from the turn of the 17th century, a companion piece to that play Hamlet that it is so decisively attempting to replace in my argument. Twins, Viola and Sebastian, have both been shipwrecked to Illyria, where they are separated, each thinking the other drowned. Dressed as a male servant, Cesario, Viola joins the household of the Duke Orsino, promptly falling in love with him. He is in love with Olivia, who is in mourning for her father and brother and does not want anything to do with him. But when he sends Cesario as his messenger, something shifts. Olivia falls for Cesario, but marries the twin Sebastian by mistake, leaving Cesario, or is it Viola, free to get together with Orsino. In the background, another servant, Malvolio, also falls for his superior, but this time no dice. He is first ridiculed and then humiliated and is entirely unreconciled by the end of the play. A melancholy clown and the ardent friend of Sebastian, Antonio, are also characters a bit adrift as the comedy comes to its conclusion. And I want to just go really quickly through 3 things that I think emphasize this play's affordances for us in the 21st century. The first is about migration. The second is about gender and sexuality. And the third is about endings and the future. Writing in their introduction to the collection Shakespeare and Immigration, David Reuter and Ruben Espinosa acknowledge the interest of this juxtaposition, given that, quote, immigration, practice and debate inform upon and indeed shape our individual and national identities today, and so might they help to colour and vitalise our experience with Shakespeare. It feels somewhat inadequate to our moment, but I'll say it nevertheless, to observe that if this was true when these scholars wrote in 2014, it is exponentially more relevant now. And I think that we can place Twelfth Night, interestingly, into this conversation. We used to think that the Illyria of the play was a fairy tale, unreal place. But recent work by scholars, including Patricia Parker and Amberine Dadaboy, among others, has reset that. Illyria was a real place, a contact zone between Islam and Christianity, much like Cyprus in Jonathan Bates' prescient reading of Othello. It seems to me relevant that we never know where Viola and Sebastian have come from, nor why they are traveling and where it is they hope to get to. The play seeks to mystify that for reasons that resonate with the disrupted national narratives of many migrants, trying to tell an acceptable story about their origins that will enable them to escape, to resettle, or to claim asylum. In the scene where we first meet Sebastian, for example, the text is heavy with what cannot be said. Sebastian here reveals that he, in about the middle of that speech, reveals that he has been living under an alias. You must know of me then, Antonio. My name is Sebastian, which I called Rodrigo. My father was that Sebastian of Messalene, whom I know you have heard of. Why on earth Sebastian has been pretending to be called Rodrigo, Lord alone knows. It is part of a scene that is circumlocutory, latinate, evasive, disclosing and obscuring through complex and portentous phrase making. It's a kind of playbook of Leontes, maybe, from The Winter's Tale, or Angelo in Measure for Measure. The way deluded, self-deluded, and a slight shifty kind of masculinity tries to obscure the truth. Sebastian here refers to, quote, the malignancy of my fate. My determinate voyage is mere extravagancy. I could not with such estimable wonder over far believe that. And this is a very odd way to speak to his dear friend. It's a very odd, oddly overwrought piece of prose. Perhaps we could read this, or perhaps we should read this obscured communication as the unspeakable desire for Antonio in this scene. That's been an increasingly common way to understand the networks of desire in this play, to think about Antonio and Sebastian as a couple in some way. But what's more interesting, I think, here for me is the place rather than the love that dare not speak its name. Sebastian's revelation of his true identity is secured here first through lineage. My name is Sebastian, my father was that Sebastian, and then through place of Messalene. That clue of Messalene offers a glimpse of the twins' lost home. Except that actually it doesn't. Even though you feel as if Messalene should be somewhere and that perhaps you've even been there, it doesn't actually seem to be a real place. It's a kind of bit of one sort of word and a bit of another. No one can find it in the Mediterranean, although it feels as if it belongs there. Editors tend to emend it, sometimes to Marseille, sometimes to other real Messina or other real places. But I think that may be the wrong thing to try to do. That's to say, I don't think we should be trying to clarify this as a real place. I think the significance for me of this speech is that Sebastian's statement of origins is a fake. It sounds as if Messalene is a place that you could have come from, but in fact, if you probe it, it just doesn't exist. He didn't come from there. He seems to be telling us where he's from, but the answer is more obscure, more unknowable, perhaps nowhere. This contributes to a larger absence in the play's backstory, presenting Viola and Sebastian as people who have left behind their place of origin, occluded that place in their self-descriptions, arrived in a strange country after a dangerous and traumatic voyage, reinvented themselves with new names, and settled, showing courage and resilience in a place that does not recognize their status or talents, makes them, I think, immediately recognizable as forced migrants. it makes a particular kind of sense of the way in which people keep trying to offer Cesario money, and he keeps replying hotly, "I am not a servant." It might also give an explanation for Viola's otherwise undermotivated decision to present herself as Cesario. Of course, she can't do anything a normal person would do, like send to somebody to say, "I've been shipwrecked," since she has entered the country illegally. Her identity makes a kind of pragmatic, self-preserving sense. And perhaps her whole narrative in the play resonates with a kind of psychic experience of estrangement. The phrase, "I am not what I am," in Act 3 reverberates. It is definitely in excess of what is required by that particular situation. I am not what I am. James Sutton calls this phrase the exilic formula, the formula of exile. Cesario's new identity might read differently if we thought of it as a function of spatial rather than gendered dislocation. What Cesario embodies is a kind of dysphoria of place rather than of body. The critic Clifford Leach suggested that Viola, quote, "is an honorary Illyrian from the moment of her appearance." I'm guessing he never had much problem at immigration. The problem, the picture the play presents is more complicated. Gaining rather than already enjoying Illyrian status may well explain Sebastian's willingness to marry Olivia. Marriage is no more a surefire route to citizenship than now, but it probably does help. Sebastian's own journey is less to what Northrop Frye called comedy's green world, the alternative location like the Forest of Arden where problems can be resolved through playfulness, and more towards a green card. Of course, he will accept Olivia's overheated matrimonial plans. Opening up migration as a heuristic here helps us reflect on difficult contemporary ideas like the ideal immigrant. Does Sebastian turn straight to increase his acceptability? How does the twins' class status smooth their path? And also about the overlap between racial categories and migration status then and now. Twelfth Night has lots of echoes of Othello and occupies, as we've seen, a similar contact zone, but it entirely sidesteps that play's obsessional race-making. In some ways, Twelfth Night might be seen to present a fantasy of magical assimilation. It uses the genre of romantic comedy to overwrite its more troubled geopolitics. The charge that Twelfth Night is too frictionless, too committed to resolving rather than sitting with difficulties, partly attaches to the second specific resonance I want to touch on today, its play with sexuality and gender. It's tempting to see the play's second or subtitle, "What You Will," as a kind of anything goes, whatever you fancy, any which way, or as Stephen Orgel memorably put it, recalling the end of Billy Wilder's "Some Like It Hot," nobody's perfect. Indeed, the play enjoys same-sex attachments, Olivia for Viola, Orsino for Cesario, Antonio for Sebastian, Andrew for Toby, and is unwilling to give them up, even in its conclusion. It is, I think, an unapologetically queer drama. But aspects of this are usefully problematic in the present. Early modern scholarship, informed by trans studies, has been rightly, I think, exasperated by the idea that Twelfth Night, with its female Viola dressed as, presenting as the male Cesario, must be trans studies' joyful central exemplar. But perhaps, like Othello, this rhymes with the problem of the present rather than transforming it. There's a whole fascinating and resonant history to unpack here. Colby Gordon has recently pointed out that the terms transvestite and cross-dressing had their harmful origins in the normative sexology of the late 19th and early 20th century, but, or I think he might feel and, have retained a pseudo-clinical epistemological hold on discussions of Shakespeare's comedies. That's to say, we don't say cross-dressing anywhere except for about Shakespearean comedy. The critic, says Gordon, like the clinician, is invested in diagnosing and then reinscribing true gender. It does seem relevant that everyone in this play world calls its central character Cesario. Even when Viola's apparently real name is revealed when the twins are reunited, the play text, its stage directions and the stage directions and speech prefixes of the play always call her Viola. So too does the critical discourse around the play. She's always Viola, she's always she. How might this contest over naming resonate in our own non-binary world? It's a good example there when Viola first appears in man's attire. So Viola we get as the speech prefix, but we get this three uses of the name Cesario. It's really important that we establish it. And of course, we don't know that Viola is called Viola if we're hearing the play rather than reading it. Time is pressing, so I want to end with something about time itself, about futurity, and about resilience. You may know this popular wartime poster from the UK, which has had an interesting revival in recent times. We might embellish it a bit for our play, and also to notice inter alia, if you want to fox ChatGPT, ask it to render the phrase all along. It can't cope with the ALL and then AL, which is a small chink of hope for our continued relevance. So this is all, these posters, this keep calm and carry on is all a bit kooky, isn't it? It's all a bit pious, but bear with me. I don't blame it all on Aristotle or on the vagaries of textual survival, but I do think that our cultural valorization of tragedy can make us deprecate the lives we are actually leading and fetishize instead the doomed glamour of the tragic hero. Most of us happily exist not in the tragic spotlight, but in the mundane, get-on-with-it world of comedy with our co-workers and other members of our community. We have allowed those philosophers and ethicists and professors and school boards to emphasize Shakespearean tragedy as the key document of human civilization, and with it, attitudes to fate, to agency, and to women that are all, I think, limitations on the futures we might imagine. If we had expended that effort and cultural investment in comedy, well, we might have made some difference. It's a truism to say that tragedy has no future, that it is the corpse of time itself that comes to lie lifeless on the stage at the end, along with all the other bodies. By contrast, Twelfth Night is highly conscious of reiterative time. Its roistering characters are up so late, it's already early morning. Human possibility is seen through the grammatical progress. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. For Jan Kott, Twelfth Night has a cast of 4 mythical characters: a man, a youth, a woman, and time. And there's an unusual modern technological resonance to this. Across his works, Shakespeare rarely uses watch in the new sense. The OED's first citation is a decade before the play to mean a portable timepiece. No character in any other of the plays appears to own one. But there are 2 watches in Twelfth Night. The priest, unnecessarily, has one with which to check the time since the marriage. And Malvolio imagines that he will have one as part of the booty he will acquire when he marries his wealthy mistress. And in addition, there is a clock. At a point in Twelfth Night, when Olivia begins to realize that she's making little headway with Orsino's messenger Cesario, there's one of the folio texts, mere handful of stage directions beyond entrances and exits. This stage direction, clock strikes, seems to me particularly significant. The clock, Olivia immediately sees, upbraids me with the waste of time. The play sees it needs to pick up the pace towards a comic resolution and starts to pack up its elaborate fictions. Methinks, says Olivia, that it is time to smile again. There is, the play identifies at this point, crucially, still time and still a journey to undertake. There lies your way, due west, then westward ho. Like me, Twelfth Night sees the clock running down, but nevertheless it can still imagine a future, compromised, a bit shop-soiled, visibly mended, pragmatic rather than idealistic, but a future nevertheless. And so must we. Thank you.
time for a few questions. There's a microphone to your hand.
Thank you for this wonderful and amazing lecture. While you talked about, while you suggested comedy, and particularly Twelfth Night, and it is a very optimistic and hopeful idea, I was wondering, since you also mentioned relevance and congruence and cultural echo, I was wondering how much, because comedy is so culturally specific, how portable would it be in places where Shakespeare is adapted or translated, for example, in non-Anglophone cultures, where audiences encounter him through translation or adaptation alone? So how optimistic or hopeful would it be for those audiences?
Thanks. That's a really great question. One of the things that you kindly sort of skirting around about my lecture, which I appreciate, is that I didn't really distinguish between laughter and humor and comic structure. I think my optimism is about comic structure, not about comic mood or comic set pieces or the capacity to generate laughter. So in some ways, that feels to me a more portable aspect of these plays, that you tend to keep the shape, but not necessarily the detail. What makes people what makes people laugh, but also what challenges people's assumptions in a comic way in different scenarios is you're absolutely right, is very different, very culturally specific. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you, yes, for a wonderfully thought-provoking and thoroughly enjoyable lecture as well. I had a question about, and I'm totally with you on Twelfth Night, and its importance, the green space it offers to inhabit different imaginative possibilities, and the need for that particularly right now. What I'm wondering, though, is how you accommodate the cruelty of the play and also the unresolved, well, Malvolio's unresolved need for revenge at the end. That doesn't ever feel very hopeful to me.
No, and it shows that actually futurity is not necessarily about things getting better. I mean, it made me think that revenge is a commitment to the future. One of the ways that people have understood revenge in this period is as some kind of reckoning with death, which counters the endingness of death and commits revenge participants to some kind of future reconciliation or something. So you're right that Malvolio's promise, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you" at the end is does acknowledge a future beyond the end of the play, which in itself has a kind of resilience, kind of anti-tragic resilience, but it's not a future which we'd like to be in. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that, I mean, one of the things that's changed about this play over the last 50 years, perhaps a little bit longer than that, is the sense that the treatment of Malvolio is cruel in a way that cannot now be allowed, can't really, almost can't be contained by the structure of the play anymore. And I think that I can see from your question that what I've emphasized too much in what I've been saying is the positive things about comedy. And I think comedy is very, very, very uncomfortable. But I think it is about trying and failing. I suppose what I was trying to argue is about trying and failing to live in community. And some of that is not very nice. And I guess that's what I would say about Malvolio. So it's not a way of saying these are plays because everybody is lovely to each other or because the good people survive, because that isn't what life is like either. But they are plays about an ongoing sense that you can try again. You know, and if you wanted to be Beckettian, you would say, you know, fail better, fail again, fail better, you know, try again. But there is something about that willingness to recommit, which feels to me a comic, a kind of comic encouragement to us. Yeah, it's thought-provoking the way you've put that for me. Thank you.
It's interesting you mentioned Rodrigo as being a sort of invention. And it's because the other place that Shakespeare uses this is in well, obviously the character in Othello, and it's also coincident that Iago is the other person that says, "I am not what I am." And when he says it to Rodrigo, he says, "It is as sure as you are as you are a Rodrigo." I just wondered if there's any thoughts you have about the name Rodrigo appealing to Shakespeare, and that's the bit that's not in Cinzio in the origin of that's invented, the Rodrigo part in Othello, as you know.
Yes, I've thought a lot about that, about whether there's a sort of invented set of connections between these plays, where Othello's Rodrigo escapes from Cyprus and then is shipwrecked in Twelfth Night, and this time the woman, the noble woman, really is in love with him. So he gets to revisit the trick that Iago plays on him in Othello by saying Desdemona really, really loves you. In fact, clearly that's not the case in Othello, but it comes to be the case. The Desdemona equivalent in Twelfth Night does fall for Sebastian Rodrigo. I think there are lots and lots of parallels between the two plays. I like Ernst Honigmann's redating of Othello, which puts it as a late Elizabethan play and sort of moves away a bit from that sort of Lepanto-y, James I-y kind of associations. And so that puts them together very, very interestingly. And the third thing, which I've talked about elsewhere, that I might put with that, which also seems chronologically to chime in with it, but seemed so topical right now that I couldn't bear to do it, was the book of Sir Thomas More. So the speech which you may have seen whizzing around social media that Ian McKellen delivered on the Colbert Show, which is a speech about, which has a foot, I think, in Othello, but also a foot in Twelfth Night. So it's interesting to think about what Shakespeare is working on at that particular point in his career. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. This was an excellent talk. It was very interesting. I really liked the point that you made about the comedic structure kind of enabling an envisioning of possible futures. I'm wondering what you think of, and you may have not seen the specific example I'm thinking about, but I've seen a couple different examples of a fictional adaptation of a Shakespeare story recently, specifically of tragedies. I'm thinking of Chloe Zhao's movie Hamlet that came out very recently.
We're all thinking of that, yeah.
Oh yes,
it's
fabulous. Yeah. Everyone should watch it. But that is a fictional adaptation of Hamlet that I think has I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending, for me at least, actually did envision a possible future of navigating the grief that is very present at the end of Hamlet. So I'm wondering, obviously, one of the takeaways from this talk is that the comedic structure of Shakespeare's comedies, it is a possible avenue to understand our current reality. I'm wondering what you think also of using fictionalized adaptation as a potential way to take Shakespeare's tragedies and maybe align them more with what we're understanding is present in the comedic structure.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting. That's a really interesting way to put that. I think Shakespeare adaptations are fascinating because they always give us a hint what we wish the Shakespeare had been able to do. So they are recuperative or improving in a way which can seem very heretical, but they give us the Shakespeare that we wish we'd had or that we need right now. And it seems to me that Hamlet needs a Shakespeare whose works are fueled by personal emotion, that secures their authenticity and secures their claim on us because they come from somewhere which is not from reading. Because that for us is not, we're in an age of performed sort of authenticity, aren't we? Where, if you say you went along the sea path and were cured along the way, and actually you actually weren't cured or you weren't ill in the first place. You know, your book, having been much fated, it collapses because it's the desirability of that book was secured by its truth. It's a truth claim, and I think it's so interesting to make Hamlet a truth claim through Hamlet. You know, that there is something behind this. So yeah, definitely adaptation is one of the recuperative techniques that we use on tragedy, and we often use it to highlight futures, the idea that there is a future beyond this, whereas most of Shakespeare's tragedies don't really do that. They've completed their movement, and the people who are speaking at the end, who are saying, "Oh, we the young shall never see so much nor live so long." I mean, it's sort of blah blah. I mean, nobody's listening. It's not about this is what we're going to do next, because really it is all over. So I would see Hamlet as a kind of attempt to turn Hamlet into a kind of comedy. That's to say, not funny, but recuperative, organized around women's experience rather than men's. You know, so it's got lots of sort of comedic elements. So it's a really helpful example to bring up. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I had a pretty similar question in how, and I think you kind of just touched on it in the answer, but how you can distinguish between the hope that happens at the end of a comedy and the hope that happens at the end of a tragedy, where I mean, you just said like kind of like the nonsense where they're rebuilding society, but at like the end of Lear, where Edgar is left to rebuild society, and there is that kind of hope. Same with Macbeth, where Malcolm presents in his final soliloquy a hope that they're going to rebuild Scotland, that there's going to be this restate of order. And at least to me, in a lot of the tragedies, seeing the final surviving characters presenting a more hopeful take in rebuilding the destruction that's been set up by the tragic character. And how is that different than the hope that we have at the end of the comedies?
Yeah, that's really, really well put. I mean, I think that performance history would suggest that at the moment we don't really believe in those hopeful characters at the end. I cannot think when I last saw a Malcolm in the theatre where you thought, "Oh, thank God." Thank God, after all this, now finally it's going to be all right. And the Thanes and all of that, they're going to earls, and it's going to be great. I mean, Malcolm is always, and we could argue about whether the play itself, you know, wants to compromise him, but I think we are at a point, that's to say, where those suggestions of rebuilding in the future tend to seem very hollow. Even, for example, a figure like Richmond at the end of Richard III, who is almost the kind of archetype for this, can seem now like a sinister figure who, you know, where did he come from? What's you know, what are we out of the frying pan into the fire in some way? So that's one way of thinking about it, that actually to make tragedies hopeful at all is quite a stretch, and it doesn't seem to be kind of where we are. And we might feel that in performance, tragedies and comedies of Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies have come a bit closer together, actually, that we are all in for the unsettled ending and the, you know, it's not all over yet, and maybe there would be something else happening in the wings. So that might be a way in which they're more similar, but the genres are more similar, but they're not similar because they are hopeful. They're similar because they are cynical or compromised about the future.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your lecture. My question is about Shakespeare coming back to life. I'm sure we're not expecting Shakespeare to revive or to resuscitate in any way. My question is, in a world where we see, where we read books written in a rather scholastic way, meaning that it's all about techniques, creative writing workshops or something. Is there a future? How are the future writers going to write? Do they have to learn the technique at universities, schools of all sorts, or Shakespeare himself did not have any formal training on writing? So it's a little bit of a dreamlike question, but
yeah, it's an interesting comparison with now, isn't it? I mean, some people would argue Shakespeare does have a training in certain kinds of writing. He has a very heavily linguistic and actually poetic translative curriculum at grammar school, so that he is writing a lot, writing in one form or another back and forth through translation. So he does get a training which we might not quite recognize. I mean, a technical training, but also a kind of emotional training about how you inhabit different perspectives or make a different view of the world seem compelling. So I think I would argue he does get a training. And to take your point forward to the present day, I am not a creative writer myself. I don't write fiction or novels. I consume a lot of fictional writing, some of which seems to me by people who I know from their biographies have come brilliantly through MFA programs or creative writing programs, and some seems not to be. So I'm absolutely agnostic about that question about whether writing is learned or is intrinsic. I guess writers who are going to do great work have an enormous talent, but most talents need a bit of buffing up, don't they? I mean, most, you might have a very talented surgeon, but you'd still want them to do the training, or you might have a very, so that talent, I think the completely untaught talent is probably a bit of a fantasy. So, and most writers, even if they're not being formally taught, it seems to me, tend to get a bit better. They learn how to do it better by doing it. So yeah, I think it's an interesting parallel. The one thing I would say different, just to finish, about the difference now, I think if you're a writer now, you're probably encouraged, and this might come back to Hamlet, you're encouraged to write about what you know about or what you feel about. And I think in Shakespeare's education and in Shakespeare's world, you were encouraged to write about what you had read. Your store of material for writing was reading, and I think although we have some place for that in the modern creative fiction, we want people to write with a sort of emotional connection, as we talked about before. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your comments. Thank you especially again, Professor Smith, for thought-provoking and inspiring lecture. Every year, the president of the University of Notre Dame sets a theme for the university. And there are a number of events and activities and initiatives on our main campus and beyond that address that theme. The theme for this year is cultivating hope. And we thank you for a lecture that has done just that and has given us some new ways to think about how we might cultivate hope through the arts and in other ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone is welcome to join us for our reception, just the other side of this room, where informal conversation can continue on the questions raised by the lecturer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you for coming. Yeah. Wonderful. Let's do that. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's good, and we got some of the younger people. I think actually that's the question, which is amazing, amazing. I do.